The sun was going down over the Prescott Ranch, and Alice Harper carried the supply ledger out to the tack room where Levi Crowell was still tallying grain sacks by lamplight. 3 years she had crossed this yard at this hour, and she knew it by feel now, the creak of the gate hinge, the way Owen Prescott's shadow crossed the barn doors before she ever looked for him. She did not think about why she noticed these things. She simply did. She heard her father's voice before she saw him. "Give me this month's wages." Frank Harper stood just inside the gate, hat pushed back, steady enough on his feet, his words coming a half-beat slow the way they always did after a few drinks. He had not come to visit. "I gave you part of it last week," Alice said. "It's gone." "Gone where?" "I don't have to account for every dollar to my own daughter." His voice climbed. 2 ranch hands near the corral slowed their work to listen without quite looking. "Who fed you all those years? You go work another man's land and think you're above your own blood?" No, Alice did not raise her voice. She had practiced not raising it. Frank took a step closer, and that was when Owen crossed the yard from the barn. He did not ask Alice if she needed help. He only looked at the space between them and said, "She said no. This is between me and my daughter." "Then settle it somewhere else." Her wages help keep her own roof over her head. She earned them. Owen's voice did not rise either. They're hers. It was such a small thing to say. Not a promise, not a rescue. Only a fact, stated plainly, the way he might note that a fence needed mending. But Alice felt it land somewhere she didn't have a name for. Frank looked between them, found no ground to stand on, and turned the fight into a retreat. "We'll talk tonight," he said, and walked back toward town without looking at his daughter again. Owen watched him go, then turned to Alice. "You all right?" "I'm fine." He held her eyes a moment longer than the answer deserved, then let it go. He never pushed. Alice had noticed that about him longer than she could account for. She walked home in the dark, alone. The house was different before she reached the porch. A lamp burning too late. Papers spread flat where papers never sat. Frank was inside, more sober than she'd seen him in a week, and the air had the stillness of a thing already decided. The mortgage was 3 months behind. The bank's notice sat on the table like something already dead. Frank had gambled away the money that should have gone toward it. That was why he'd come for her wages. Alice did the sum in her head before he finished explaining. Even everything she'd saved would not cover it. "If you'd given me what you made," Frank started. "It still wouldn't have been enough." She said it without heat, and he had no answer for that. It was the first time in her life she had told him a hard truth, and simply let it sit there, unsoftened. He told her they would leave as soon as the house was settled. "A cousin in Nebraska. Work waiting. We'll go as soon as this is done," he said. "We?" He looked at her as if the question made no sense at all. "Where else would you go?" Alice didn't answer. That night, she lay awake in the room that had been hers since she was a girl, and instead of thinking about the mortgage, she found herself thinking about supper at the ranch, Owen at the head of the table, Levi grumbling over a feed receipt that didn't add up, the particular sound the kitchen made when the work was done and no one was in a hurry to leave it. She thought of all of it the way a person thinks of something they are about to lose, though she had not yet told anyone she meant to fight for it. Alice came to the ranch the next morning, the same as always. She did not say anything about the mortgage, or Nebraska, or the cousin waiting there with work. She went through the pantry and wrote out what needed buying for the week, though she would not be the one to buy it. She checked the same page of the supply ledger twice, then a third time, though the numbers had not changed since the first look. Owen noticed. He always seemed to notice things without appearing to look for them. "You've checked that page twice," he said, passing through the kitchen with a bridle over his shoulder. "3 times, Alice said. He held her gaze a moment, then went on to the barn without asking why. Levi noticed too, in his own way. He watched her tally the flour and coffee with more care than the task required, and said nothing, only nodded once when she finished, as though he already understood something she had not told him yet. By evening the work was done, and there was no reason left to stay. Alice found Owen at the barn entrance, coiling a length of rope that did not need coiling. "I won't be here much longer," she said. He stopped. "Why?" She told him plainly: the house, her father's debts, the cousin in Nebraska, the work waiting there, the leaving that would happen as soon as the bank finished its business. "Is that what you want?" Owen asked. Alice opened her mouth to answer and found she had none ready. No one had ever asked her that question. Not her father, not Owen, not anyone she could remember. "I don't know," she said. The silence after that lasted longer than either of them seemed to expect. "There's something else," Alice said finally. She had not planned the words. She only found herself already saying them. "I didn't want to leave without telling you." She stopped. Owen waited, still holding the coiled rope in both hands. "I love you." He did not move. It was not surprise on his face, not exactly. More the look of a man watching something he had known was coming for a long time finally arrive at his door, and finding he still was not ready for it. "I'm sorry, Alice." His voice was quiet. "I can't." Not, "I don't love you." She noticed that, even then, even with her chest gone tight and her ears ringing faintly. He had not said that. She did not ask him to explain. She only nodded once, the way she nodded when a supply order came back short and there was nothing to do but note it and move on. "I understand," she said. She did not, but she turned and walked back toward the house, and Owen did not call after her. He stood alone at the barn door until the rope was coiled tight and even, and then he stood a while longer, with nothing left in his hands to occupy them. He was thinking of a room he had not let himself think of in a long time. A wife who had gone quiet too fast, blood soaking through everything before anyone could stop it. A child who had not lived long enough to need a name outside the family Bible. He had lost them within the same hour and buried them together beneath the same cottonwood, and gone back to work because it was the only thing he knew how to do with his hands. 5 years he had kept the ranch alive and kept himself upright, and told himself that was the same as living. He had never called it a promise to anyone. It had simply become the shape of his life, the way a fence follows the land it was built on, until a man forgets there was ever a choice in the line it took. He picked up the rope again, though there was nothing left to do with it, and went back to work. The next morning, Alice found Levi in the tack room before sunup, going through the feed inventory by lamplight the way he did every day, whether anyone else was awake to see it or not. "I need to tell you I'm leaving," she said. "End of the month, maybe sooner." Levi did not look up right away. "Leave?" She explained it as plainly as she had explained it to Owen. The house. Her father. Nebraska. "Your father's leaving," Levi said. "I asked about you." Alice did not know what to say to that. Levi set down the tally sheet and looked at her properly for the first time that morning. He told her, without much ceremony, that his knees were not what they used to be, that his back gave him trouble climbing into the loft now, and that he did not have many more full seasons left in him. He told her that in nearly 3 years he had watched her run the household stores without waste and without confusion, catching a bad delivery count before anyone else noticed it was short. He said he wanted to start teaching her the ranch books, wages, supplies, purchasing, the whole daily running of the place. "I've never managed a ranch," Alice said. "Neither had I," Levi said, "until somebody showed me." He did not tell her she was gifted. He told her she had the beginnings of it, and that the rest would take real work, and that she would make mistakes he expected her to learn from and not repeat twice. The position, he said, would keep her close to the house at all hours, early for deliveries, late for the books. There was a small room off the kitchen that had stood empty since the last housekeeper married and moved to town. It came with the work. He had already spoken to Owen about it. Alice understood, standing there in the half-dark of the tack room, that she was not being carried along by anyone's decision but her own. She did not have to go to Nebraska. She had never actually had to. She found Owen later that morning near the corral, and the conversation between them was careful in a way it had never been before yesterday. "Levi told me what he offered you," Owen said. "Yes. If you want the work, the room comes with it." He paused. "If you don't, I'll understand." "After what I said yesterday?" Alice asked. "The job has nothing to do with that." It should have been a relief to hear it. Instead, it landed somewhere close to pain, though she could not have said exactly why. Perhaps because she believed him. An offer with no strings attached to what she had confessed the night before was, in its own way, harder to carry than one wrapped in pity would have been. "I'll take the work," she said. Owen nodded once and went back to the corral fence, and that was the whole of it. She told Frank that evening. He took it worse than she expected, and not as badly as she had feared. "You're staying with him?" "I'm staying for the work." "Don't make a fool of yourself, Alice. A man like that doesn't offer a room for nothing." "I'm staying," she said again, and did not explain further. Frank left for town alone the next morning. It was the first time in longer than Alice could remember that he had walked away from her without getting what he came for, and something in the set of his shoulders told her he knew it too. The first few mornings in the room off the kitchen were awkward in a way neither of them said aloud. Alice came down before light out of old habit, and more than once found Owen already at the stove. Twice it was the other way, Owen coming down to find her there first, and for a moment neither of them seemed to know whether to speak about the day ahead or simply stand in the kitchen not looking at each other. One of those mornings, without seeming to think about it, Owen took down 2 cups instead of 1, and had the coffee poured before he noticed what his hands had done. He stopped, a cup in each, and Alice, standing by the window with the ledger already under her arm, noticed too. Neither of them said anything about it. He set 1 cup on the table across from his own chair, the way he always had before the barn door. After a moment, Alice sat and drank a little of it, though she left before it was finished, and it did not happen again for a while after that. Levi did not make it easy on her, whatever she might have hoped. The first morning, he set the wage book, the feed receipts, and the freight ledger in front of her together, and told her to read back what they meant. Then came the rest of it in pieces over the following days. Which hands were paid by the month and which by the season. How the cost of a hired man during roundup was reckoned against what he brought in. Why a sick steer cost the ranch twice, once in the animal itself, and once in the days a hand spent nursing it instead of working the herd. By noon most days, her head ached with numbers. She was careful, the way she had always been careful, and she thought she had the week's supply order figured close to exact, until Levi looked over her shoulder and asked a single question. "What's missing?" Alice checked her sums again. Everything added correctly. She said so. "Then what's missing?" Levi said again, not unkindly, and waited. It took her a long minute to see it. The freight charge. She had priced the goods themselves down to the penny and forgotten entirely what it cost to haul them out from town. "You'll remember next time," Levi said, and went back to his own work as though the matter were already closed. She did remember. She never made that particular mistake again, though there were others waiting whose shape she had not yet learned. A week later, she tried to trim an order she thought ran too high, cutting back on grain she judged they could stretch through to the next delivery. Levi let her make the case before he answered it. "Sheep now," he said, "cost twice in February, when you're buying the same feed at a worse price with less of it to go around, or the stock goes thin waiting on it." He was not scolding her. He was only laying it out the way he laid out everything, plainly, so she could see the shape of the mistake herself. Saving $1 today isn't saving anything if it costs you $3 next month. Alice went back and restored the order to what it had been. She did not argue. She had been raised to make do with less, and it was a harder habit to unlearn than she expected. One evening, after Levi had gone home and Alice was still bent over a column of figures that would not balance, Owen came in to bank the stove and found her rubbing her eyes. "Levi ever tell you about the season he taught me the books?" he asked. "No. I added a whole herd twice into the tally. Told him we had 400 more head than we did." A pause. "He let me go 2 weeks thinking we were rich before he pointed it out." Alice laughed, surprised into 2 weeks? 2 weeks. I'd already started figuring what to do with the money. It was such a small thing, and it was not really about the cattle at all. Owen did not usually offer stories about himself unprompted, and Alice understood, without either of them saying so, that he had told her this one on purpose. to see if she still could. Owen noticed the change in her, the way he noticed most things without seeming to look. In the first weeks, when a question came up about supplies or wages, he sent it straight to Levi. Then, gradually, without remark, he began asking Alice what Levi had said. And later still, standing over the ledger with her one evening while Levi was out at the corral, he asked her outright, "What do you think?" It was a small question. It did not feel small. She still kept the distance she had set for herself since the barn door. There had been evenings, before, when the books were closed and she stayed anyway, coffee going cold between them while the house settled around its own quiet. Now, when the figures balanced, she closed the ledger and stood. "Anything else?" she asked. "No," Owen said. "Good night." She left him there most evenings with the lamp still burning and the chair across from his still empty. He did not ask her to stay. But more than once, passing the kitchen later at night, he found himself noticing the particular silence of a house where someone was still present but had stopped sitting down. The house went the way houses go when there is no money left to stop it. Frank did not fight it, not because he had accepted anything, but because there was nothing left to fight with. He moved into a room above the livery in town, paid week to week, and took what pride he could in not asking Alice for help with the rent. He did not, however, take the blame with him. Around town, he told a version of it that left out the gambling and the months he had spent hiding the debt. In his telling, a daughter who kept her wages for herself instead of helping her own father, and a rancher who had turned that daughter against her own blood, had cost him everything. He said it enough times, in enough places, that it began to travel on its own. The talk reached Alice the way talk usually did, sideways. A conversation stopping short when she stepped into the mercantile. A clerk's smile that did not reach his eyes when he asked, a little too carefully, whether she was still just working for Mr. Prescott. A woman she had known for years, finding sudden business at the far end of the counter, rather than exchange the usual few words. Nothing anyone said to her face, only the shape of what people were not quite saying. Alice had grown up watching her father talk his way around a room, and she knew the particular damage a story could do once it was let loose among people who wanted something to discuss. She could not chase it down and correct it point by point. She could only refuse to give it anywhere new to land. So she kept ordering the week's supplies the same as always, checking the tally against her list, counting her change twice out of habit rather than suspicion, speaking to the clerk in the same flat, businesslike voice she used for every transaction. If her hands shook faintly, folding the receipt into her pocket, no one in the store was close enough to see it. It found Owen instead. A man at the feed store, loud enough to be heard, said something about Prescott keeping his housekeeper close for reasons that had nothing to do with housekeeping. Owen did not raise his voice, and he did not raise a hand. "Miss Harper works for me," he said. "Speak to her accordingly." That was all. No speech, no claim laid on her in front of the room. The man muttered something and found other business to attend to. Alice heard about it before the day was out. "You didn't have to do that," she told him that evening. "Yes, I did. Because I work for you?" Owen was quiet a moment, as though the question had caught him somewhere he had not expected. "Because he was wrong," he said. Alice did not know what to do with that answer. It sat with her longer than she wanted it to. The trouble showed itself the way trouble usually did in Alice's new work. Quietly, inside a column of figures nobody else had thought to add up the same way. She was reconciling the past year's feed use against what was currently penned and what was already put up for winter, when the numbers refused to balance the way she expected. She checked them twice, then laid last year's tally beside this year's herd count and the freight schedule for hay coming in from town. At this rate, she told Owen the next morning, they'd be short before February. Owen did not ask her to repeat it. How short? She gave him the number. Levi checked her figures himself that afternoon, moving through them slower than Alice had, and came back with the same answer she had reached. He did not seem surprised so much as satisfied. the way a man is satisfied to have a suspicion confirmed rather than invented. What to do about it was not Alice's to decide alone, and she did not try to make it so. Levi and Owen argued it out over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, whether to sell off the weaker stock now, while prices still held, or wait and risk losing more to the winter itself. Whether the remaining herd could be moved onto the south pasture a few weeks early. Alice sat through both conversations. When they asked her opinion, it was never about the cattle. It was about what buying early would cost against what buying late would cost. How many weeks a given decision bought them. What the freight would run if they had to order more hay before the roads iced over. She answered what she knew and left the rest to the 2 men who had spent their lives learning it. One of the older hands, a man named Coburn, who had worked the ranch longer than Alice had been alive, balked the first time she gave him an instruction about which pasture to move a string of cattle to. He looked past her toward Levi, the way he always had. "She already answered you," Levi said, and did not repeat it himself. Coburn did the work. The plan held, and the ranch avoided buying at the worst price it would have paid 2 weeks later. After that, when a small decision needed making before it could wait for Owen, the hands came to Alice first more often than not. Nobody made a ceremony of it. It simply began happening. One evening, with Levi already gone home and the lamp burning low over the ledger, Alice made a small mistake in a column of figures and caught it herself a moment later, laughing before she could stop herself. The sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Owen. He looked at her longer than the moment called for. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. But it was not nothing. It was the same unguarded sound he had heard once before, over a story about 400 head of cattle that never existed, except this time neither of them had meant to make it happen. And sitting there with the ledger between them, he understood that what he had missed in the weeks since was not only the sight of her handling the books well, it was her voice across the table. The particular way she argued a point before conceding it. The coffee going cold because neither of them had noticed the hour. A few nights later, Alice found a small, framed photograph behind a stack of old receipts in the desk drawer she was clearing for the new ledgers. A young woman in a high-collared dress, unsmiling in the way photographs demanded then. She moved to set it aside without a word. Her name was Elizabeth, Owen said from the doorway. "I'm sorry," Alice said, and did not ask anything more. Owen was quiet a moment. "She died, bringing our child into the world." He did not say anything else, and Alice did not press him to. She understood, standing there with the drawer half open, exactly why he had said what he had said at the barn door weeks before. She did not let it become hope. If anything, it settled something in her more firmly than before. She would not ask him again. Frank found her outside the ranch house on a gray afternoon, sober this time, which was somehow worse than the last time he had been drunk. A gambling debt, smaller than the one that had cost him the house, but real enough to matter, had followed him from town, and he had nowhere left to turn but his daughter. He did not shout. He did not need to. "You're all I've got," he said. It landed exactly where he meant it to. Alice had built her whole life, without quite meaning to, around the belief that being needed was the nearest thing to being loved she was ever going to get. And here was her father, handing her the oldest, surest way back into that belief, wrapped now in nothing but plain need. She thought, unbidden, of a version of him further back than she usually let herself remember. A man who had once mended her shoes himself rather than pay a cobbler, who had not always needed saving from himself. That man was gone now, worn away by years of cards and whiskey. But the memory of him was the reason she still stood there, listening, instead of walking away. Owen was at the corral fence, close enough to see, far enough not to interfere. He did not come forward. He let her have it. "Please, Alice." Frank's voice cracked on it, real enough that she almost believed the crack was for her and not for himself. She had savings now, more than she had ever had in her life, put by dollar from a wage she had earned herself. She knew to the cent what it would cost to hand it over. She knew, just as clearly, what it would cost her to start the cycle again. The wages given, the debt paid, the gratitude that never lasted past the next hand of cards. "I'll buy you a meal," she said. "I'll help you find honest work. I won't pay another gambling debt." "After everything I did for you?" His face went hard, the guilt turning to anger the way it always had. "I know what you did," she said, and did not soften it. Frank turned on the one target left to him. "He turned you against your own blood." "No," Alice said. "I made this choice." It was the truest thing she had ever said to him, and the plainest. Frank looked at her a long moment, found nothing left to say, and walked back toward town alone. Owen crossed the yard once he was gone. He did not say he was proud of her. He only asked, "You all right?" For the first time, Alice did not say she was fine. "Not yet," she said. They sat on the porch step as the last of the light went out of the sky, not talking for a while. "There was a time he wasn't like that," Alice said eventually, "before the drinking got bad. Sat up half a night once mending my boot and self instead of paying the cobbler in town because I needed it for church in the morning. I don't know why I still remember that, when I can barely stand to be in a room with him now." Owen said nothing about Frank. He only listened, which was its own kind of answer. "Because it was true once," he said finally. "That doesn't stop being true just because the rest of it went bad." It was more than he usually offered. Alice looked at him. "Is that how it is for you? With the quiet? Since Elizabeth?" He was quiet himself a while. "It used to be fine," he said. "Lately, it isn't as much." He did not explain further, and she did not ask him to. When he spoke again, it was only to say, "All right," once more, and stay beside her, which was, for now, enough. One evening, not long after the feed shortage was settled, Owen carried 2 cups of coffee out to the porch without being asked, and set one in her hand before she could tell him she did not have time. Alice looked at the 2 cups, then at him. "You finally remembered the second one again," she said. "Never forgot," Owen said. She did not have an answer for that. She sat with him a while, the coffee going cold the way it used to, and neither of them found anything that needed saying. The talk in town had not stopped, and Alice had stopped expecting it to. It had settled into something quieter than open gossip. A few careful glances, a question asked too casually. But it had not gone away, and she doubted now that it ever fully would. By then, though, she had grown steady enough in the work that she no longer needed the room off the kitchen to do it. A widow named Mrs. Ashford kept 2 rooms for let above her dress shop in town, decent and cheap enough on Alice's new wages, and close enough to the ranch that the early mornings would still be manageable. She told Owen one evening after the ledger was closed. "I'll keep the work," she said, "but I'm going to take a room in town." "Because of Frank?" he asked. "Not only him." She explained it as plainly as she explained most things now. The room had come with the job when she needed both. She no longer needed both. "I can do the work without living here." "You don't have to leave because people talk," Owen said. "You're not the one they talk about." He had no answer for that, and did not try to invent one. "The room was part of the work," Alice said. "I don't need it anymore." Owen stood very still. It was a small thing to say, and true on its face, and it took him a moment longer than it should have to understand what it actually meant. The ranch would not lose Alice Harper. The books would still be kept, the supplies still ordered, the hands still coming to her first when a decision could not wait. Nothing about the ranch stood to lose anything at all. "When?" he asked finally. "End of the week." He nodded, once, the way he had nodded at the corral fence weeks before when she had told him she would take the position. He did not ask her to stay. He did not offer anything to keep the room occupied. He only stood there while she gathered the ledger to carry to her own trunk upstairs and let her go. It was only after she had gone up to pack that he let himself sit with the plain fact of it, alone at the kitchen table with the lamp still burning. The house would be quieter without her in it than it had been in a very long time, and he did not yet know whether that quiet frightened him because he loved her, or only because he had grown used to it not being empty. Owen rode out alone before first light, while the house was still dark behind him, and the air still held the last of the night's cold. The two graves sat under a cottonwood at the edge of the property, marked with plain stone, the way he had wanted them marked. No verse, no scripture, just names and dates. He had come here perhaps a dozen times in 5 years, always alone, always briefly, always with the same feeling of a man reporting for a duty he did not know how to finish. He stood a long while without speaking, his hat in both hands, the horse cropping grass a few yards off. He let himself remember it all the way through this time, which he rarely did, Elizabeth's hand in his, still warm. Her first word after it was over had not been his name. "The baby?" she had asked. He had not answered fast enough. She had looked at his face and understood before he said anything at all. He remembered how long she had stayed with him after that, asking small things, holding his hand, before the bleeding took the rest of her strength and then her breath. It had not been quick, whatever he had told people over the years when he told them anything. He had let them believe it was fast because that was easier to say out loud than the truth of how long it had actually taken. He had spent 5 years building a life around never going through that again, and calling the result living, because admitting what it actually was had never seemed worth the cost. Loving Alice did not erase any of this. It did not undo the ground under his boots, or the 2 names on the stone, or the years he had spent since. Wanting a life with her tomorrow did not make the years he'd had with Elizabeth smaller, or less his, or less real. He put his hand on the stone for a moment. "I miss you," he said. "I always will." Then he set his hat back on, mounted up, and rode back toward the ranch. Alice was in the rear room off the kitchen, folding the last of what belonged to her into the small trunk she had brought from her father's house months before, when she heard Owen's step behind her. She thought at first it was about the work, some question about the week's accounts that could not wait for morning. "You asked me something once," Owen said. She kept folding. "I didn't ask you anything." "You told me." A pause, and I answered, "Yes." She did not turn around yet. My answer was no. Alice closed the trunk lid, slow, giving herself the time it took to do that before she turned to face him. "It isn't anymore," Owen said. Alice did not move toward him. She had spent weeks building something steady enough to stand on without him, plank by plank, the same way she'd learned to balance a ledger, and she was not willing to let one sentence knock it flat. "Owen, the ranch needs me. It'll need me whether I live in this house or a room over Mrs. Ashford's shop." "The ranch does," he held her eyes. "That's not what I'm asking." "Then what are you asking me, Owen?" "I'm asking you to stay." "For the ranch?" "No." A beat longer than the one before it. "I love you, Alice." Alice looked at him a long moment. Outside, one of the hands called something to another across the yard, ordinary and unhurried, the kind of sound that made the moment feel less like the ones in the stories her mother used to tell, and more like something that was actually going to have to be lived through. Something in her chest that had been braced for months let go all at once this time, though she did not trust her own legs enough yet to move toward him. "You were sure before," she said. "I was afraid before." "And now?" "Still am." He let that sit a moment, not dressing it up, not explaining it further. "I'm here anyway." It was not a speech. It was not the kind of thing a man said when he had rehearsed it on the ride back from the cottonwood tree, though she would learn later that he had, in his own way, turned it over the whole way home and thrown out every version that sounded too much like an argument for her benefit rather than the plain truth. Alice did not answer right away. She had confessed once already and paid for it, and she was not going to be the one to do it twice. She set the trunk down where it stood. "All right," she said. Levi's knees finally won out that spring. He did not make an announcement of it. He simply began coming in later, staying home more, and one morning told Alice plainly that the books were hers now, wages and supplies and the daily running of the place, while he would keep an eye on things from a chair by the fire when anyone still wanted his opinion. Owen kept the cattle, the land, the decisions that needed a lifetime of judgment neither Alice nor Levi could hand over. Nobody pretended she had become something she was not. She managed the numbers, he managed the herd. Between them, the ranch ran better than it had in years. She saw Frank in town that autumn, unloading freight at the depot, in work clothes gone dark with sweat, sober, and not looking for her at all. "You look well," he said when he noticed her.
"I am," Alice said.
"Work starts early," he said, nodding toward the wagon.
"I know."
Neither of them said anything more. He went back to the crates, and she went on to the mercantile, and that was the whole of it. Alice and Owen married quietly a few months later, no more ceremony than the county clerk and a handful of neighbors could account for. The rear room off the kitchen stood empty now, not because Alice had left the house, but because she no longer lived in a room that came with the work. She had a room of her own, and a husband, and a chair at the table that was hers whether the books balanced or not. One evening, ledger closed, Owen set 2 cups of coffee on the table between them. "Books straight?" he asked. "For once." "Levi would be disappointed." Alice laughed. In the weeks before the wedding, there had been the matter of Frank. Alice turned the question over for the better part of a week before she said it out loud, and even then only sideways, folding linens at the kitchen table with Owen close enough to hear. "I keep thinking about whether to ask my father." Owen did not look up right away from the harness he was mending. "Do you want to?" "I don't know if I should, after everything." "That's not what I asked." Alice set the linens down. "I don't have any family besides him, whatever he is." Owen was quiet a moment. "I don't have anyone left from mine," he said. "If you've still got your father, even a hard one, I don't think you should let him go just because it would be easier not to." She had already seen for herself, that autumn at the depot, that he was keeping steady. It was not the same as trusting it would last, but she went into town 3 days later anyway. She found him at the depot again, and told him plainly, the way she told most things now. "I'm marrying Owen Prescott, Saturday after next. I'd like you there." Frank straightened up slow, wiping his hands on his trousers before he answered, as if he needed the time as much as the courtesy. "You're asking me." "I'm asking you." He looked at her a long moment. "I'll be there," he said, and went back to the crates before either of them had to find anything else to say. The wedding was small, the way Alice and Owen had wanted it, a handful of neighbors, Levi in his good coat, a meal laid out on 2 long tables under the cottonwoods. Frank came in a clean shirt that did not quite fit him anymore, and stood at the edge of it for most of the afternoon before he found Alice alone near the porch steps. He held out a small folded bundle of bills, more than she expected, considerably less than it would have taken to matter to anyone but him. "Father, let me finish." He turned the bills over once in his hands before he gave them to her. "That house, and the land under it, that was supposed to be yours one day. I lost it. I know this doesn't fix what I did." He stopped, started again. "I just wanted to give you something, for once, that I wasn't asking back." Alice took it. She did not tell him it was too much, or that he should not have. She only said, "Thank you," and meant it plainly, the way he had meant the giving of it. Later, as the light went gold and the neighbors began drifting toward their wagons, Frank made to say his own goodbyes and go. Owen caught him at the edge of the tables. "Stay a while, Paul. There's coffee left." Frank stopped mid-step. It was a small word, said plainly, no weight put on it beyond what it already carried. Alice, a few feet away with a stack of plates in her hands, heard it too, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Frank stayed for the coffee. By the following spring, Owen was settling up a freight bill at the depot when he found himself asking the foreman a question he had been turning over since the wedding. "Frank Harper still keeping steady?" The foreman looked up from the ledger, mildly surprised to be asked outright. "Steady as they come, far as I've seen. Picked up extra shifts before that wedding of yours. Even came asking to draw his wages a few days early. Wanted something in hand for the day, is what he told me." He considered a moment. "Some of the men here play cards most lunch hours. Harper never sits in. Not once I've seen." Owen did not say much to that. He turned it over on the ride home instead, the way he turned over most things that mattered to him, slowly and mostly in silence. He started on the cabin the following week, the small one that stood empty at the edge of the home pasture. It had once housed a married hand and his wife, but had stood empty for several seasons. He spent the week mending the roof and setting a new stove where the old one had rusted through. Alice found him at it on a Sunday, sleeves rolled, and stood in the doorway a while before she said anything. "Are you building a place for a hired man?" "No." She waited. "He's getting older," Owen said, not looking up from the stovepipe. "You worry about him whether you say so or not. And he's been doing the work. Man like that, we could use another pair of hands around here." Alice understood, the way she had learned to understand most of what Owen did not say outright, that the extra pair of hands had very little to do with it. They rode into town together the following Saturday, both of them, and found Frank at the depot on his midday break, sitting apart from the men playing cards under the loading dock awning. Owen did the asking, plain as he did most things. "We've got a cabin standing empty at the ranch. Need somebody in it before winter." Frank looked between the two of them for a long moment, as if he were waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where it turned out to cost him something. "It's not charity," Owen said. "There's work enough for another pair of hands, and I'd rather give it to a man who's shown he'll do it than a stranger off the railroad." Frank looked at Alice. She did not say anything, only nodded once, the way she had learned to nod when a thing was settled and did not need saying twice. He came out to the ranch well before the first snow that fall. 6 years later, Alice and Owen sat on the porch in the last light of a summer evening, the ledger closed on the table between them and 2 cups of coffee gone lukewarm. Down by the corral fence, their son chased the ranch dog in the kind of wide, aimless circles small boys run for no reason at all, laughing hard enough that it carried all the way up to the house. Frank sat on an overturned bucket near the fence, close enough to catch the boy if the running turned to falling, calling out something neither of them could quite hear over the barking. Alice watched them a while before she picked her coffee back up. "Book straight?" Owen asked, out of habit more than need. "For once," she said, and did not look away from the yard. And that's how it ends for Alice and Owen. She was the one who finally said the words out loud. He was the one who had to find his way out from under a grief he'd been carrying alone for 5 years. Together, they built something neither of them could have built on their own, a family and a ranch to hand it down to. As for Frank, he made more mistakes than most men get the chance to walk back from. But he did the work, day after day, and in the end, the people who loved him let him back in. If you have any thoughts or feelings about this one, let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. There are new stories of frontier life here on Wild West Life every day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.